The courtroom had fallen into a silence so deep it felt almost sacred. The last word still hung in the air. Justice Stephen Breyer's voice, steady but reverent. Every head in the chamber turned toward him, as if to confirm what they'd just heard. The man who'd spent nearly 3 decades dissecting the arguments of presidents, senators, and constitutional giants had just done something no one could remember him doing before. He'd stopped, looked up from his notes, and said, with unmistakable sincerity, "That was brilliant." For a moment, time stuttered. The clerks froze mid-gesture. A pen slipped from someone's hand and clattered onto the marble floor, and a ripple of startled murmurs swept through the gallery. The reporters who had come expecting routine arguments suddenly leaned forward, their pens motionless above half-written words. In the sea of black robes and gray suits, one figure sat perfectly still. Representative Jasmine Crockett. Her expression didn't change. No grin, no gasp, no triumphant glance. Only the quiet composure of someone who'd carried disbelief on her back for years and finally set it down. Across the bench, Breyer adjusted his glasses as if even he needed to see her more clearly now. He'd heard hundreds of attorneys argue constitutional theory, but this was different. Her words hadn't been delivered with arrogance or theatrics. They had been precise, measured, layered with the lived weight of communities she spoke for. It wasn't performance, it was purpose sharpened into law. The audience could feel it too. A shift. The invisible hierarchy that usually crowned experience over conviction had, for once, bent in the opposite direction. Every unspoken rule of decorum and deference cracked a little under the gravity of what had just happened. A young black congresswoman, a former public defender from Texas, had just earned the open respect of one of America's most revered legal minds. A court accustomed to command now listened in awe. Breyer's compliment wasn't just acknowledgement, it was surrender. And in that hush, beneath the high dome and the flag's still shadow, something unthinkable became possible. That truth could speak through anyone bold enough to know it. But respect like that doesn't appear out of thin air. It's forged in struggle, in defiance, in years of proving what others refuse to see. So how did we get here? How did Jasmine Crockett make a Supreme Court justice break 27 years of composure? 24 hours earlier, the nation had been buzzing like a live wire. Every network banner pulsed with the same headline, "Voting Rights on the Line." Across cable channels, anchors dissected polling maps as if they were battlefields. The words suppression, integrity, and fraud flashed in dizzying rotation, each one weaponized to mean something different, depending on who was speaking. America wasn't just watching a case, it was watching itself, arguing through the mouths of others. On one side of the screen, retired justices and conservative pundits dismissed the new legislation as emotional overreach, a naive attempt to fix what wasn't broken. On the other side, activists and organizers called it what it was, a fight for breath, the right to cast a ballot without a barricade, the right to exist in a democracy that remembered every citizen counts. Jasmine Crockett had watched it all from her office window the night before, the talking heads, the bright graphics, the familiar hum of outrage without resolution. She knew those debates weren't really about law, they were about power. Who held it, who was allowed near it, and who got told they were lucky just to be in the room. When her staff asked if she was nervous about arguing before the court, she had smiled softly and said, "You don't get nervous defending what's right. You get ready." Morning came gray and heavy. The Capitol loomed in the distance like a monument carved out of both pride and guilt. As she approached the Supreme Court steps, her heels clicked in rhythm with the chants from a small crowd gathered behind barricades. Some held handmade signs. "Protect the vote," "Every voice matters," "Our ballot," "Our power." Their voices weren't loud enough to drown out the media chatter, but she heard them. They were the reason she was walking up those marble stairs. Inside, the mood was clinical. Clerks hurried through hallways, their arms heavy with briefs. Old portraits lined the walls, faces of men who had written the rules, rewritten them, and sometimes broken them. It wasn't lost on her that most of them would never have imagined her standing here. A black congresswoman from Dallas about to argue constitutional precedent before a panel that embodied America's contradictions. Still, she walked with the composure of someone who had nothing left to prove. She had already lived the struggle the case represented. Voters turned away for ID mismatches, polling stations closing early in communities like hers, voices discounted before they were even spoken. To her, this wasn't about partisan victory. It was about promise, the one carved into marble above the court's doors, equal justice under law. Across town, the headlines continued to scream. Commentators predicted failure, some with condescension disguised as concern. "She's sharp," one analyst said, "but Breyer's not easily impressed." Another chuckled, "Let's see if she can keep up in that arena." Their laughter traveled through screens, through wires, through history itself, the same tone that had greeted every woman, every person of color, every first-timer who dared to stand where they weren't expected. Crockett didn't hear the noise anymore. She had long since learned how to tune it out. As she paused beneath the towering columns, sunlight poured over the steps, catching the faint gold in her lapel pin. For a second, she let herself breathe. The air was different here, thinner, heavier, charged with expectation. Behind those doors were men who had shaped the meaning of freedom, and they were waiting for her to define it again. She reached for the handle, her reflection flickering against the glass, and behind those marble doors waited a test she couldn't afford to fail. Justice Stephen Breyer had always believed in the architecture of reason. To him, law was a language that only the most disciplined minds could truly speak. A cathedral built brick by brick from precedent, logic, and restraint. He wasn't cruel, nor careless. He was a man raised by order and educated by brilliance, the kind of intellect that believed truth was best protected when emotions were kept outside the chamber doors. For nearly 3 decades, that belief had never failed him. He was, by all measures, a scholar before he was a judge. Even his critics admitted his mind was formidable. Breyer read opinions the way a composer reads symphonies, hearing patterns in chaos. He prided himself on civility, on rising above the noise of partisanship that so often infected the country he served. And yet, beneath that calm surface was a quiet arrogance, the unspoken conviction that reason was the great equalizer, that intellect alone could heal the wounds of democracy. It was this very confidence that had made him untouchable. In oral arguments, lawyers stumbled under his questions. He had a knack for smiling as he cornered them, his tone gentle, but his logic merciless. To stand before him was to face the cold edge of clarity. He rarely raised his voice because he didn't need to. His words cut all on their own. Colleagues described him as professorial, measured, even kind. But kindness in Breyer's world was something bestowed, not shared. He admired young minds who mirrored his own structure, who learned to speak in the language of scholars, not streets. Passion, to him, was distraction. Empathy, an admirable trait for poets and preachers, but dangerous in the hands of lawmakers. Over the years, he had become an institution unto himself. Students quoted him. Law journals dissected him. Even his disagreements with conservative justices were couched in a kind of intellectual play, the clash of masters, not the war of ideologies. He lived above the fray, certain that if America ever lost its way, it would be because it stopped listening to people like him. Yet, beneath that elegant detachment, something had shifted. The country he thought he understood was changing faster than the court could interpret it. Voices that had once been background noise were now demanding to be heard. New lawmakers were no longer asking for the system's approval, they were demanding its accountability. And Breyer, for all his eloquence, didn't quite know what to do with that. He had seen fire before, activists pounding at the doors, senators grandstanding for the cameras. But what unsettled him most about this new generation wasn't their anger. It was their fluency. They spoke the law as fluently as he did, but they infused it with something he couldn't replicate, lived truth. It wasn't theory, it was survival, wrapped in legal citations and heartbeats. Still, he approached this new case as he had every other, with the composure of a man certain he could see further than those who came before him. Voting rights had always fascinated him, not for its moral urgency, but for its structural elegance. The balance between access and integrity, the constitutional symmetry of it all, it was beautiful, in an abstract way. But abstraction can dull empathy, and Breyer had long trained himself to prefer the clean geometry of law over the mess of humanity that animated it. The morning Jasmine Crockett appeared before him, he expected another advocate eager to impress. He had read her brief the night before, concise, well-crafted, a touch idealistic. Sharp, he murmured to a clerk, but not seasoned. The clerk smiled politely, knowing the justice loved to predict the quality of arguments before they began. He was rarely wrong. When he entered the courtroom, he carried that same quiet certainty. He adjusted his robe, greeted his colleagues, and glanced at the docket as if skimming the preface of a familiar book. The names on the page were just symbols in a larger puzzle. But as the hearing began, something unexpected stirred. Crockett's voice, steady, deliberate, didn't tremble or rush. It wasn't the cautious tone of a newcomer seeking validation. It carried the weight of someone who had seen the consequences of every abstract ruling translated into real lives. Her argument didn't just recite precedent, it revealed it, peeled it back layer by layer until the human cost beneath the ink became impossible to ignore. Breyer leaned forward. His fingers, which had been idly resting on the bench, tightened around his pen. He found himself listening, not to refute, but to understand. It was disorienting. He'd spent decades mastering the art of control, but in that moment, he realized control was slipping, replaced by something far rarer: curiosity. He studied her words, the rhythm of them, the unflinching calm. For the first time in years, Breyer felt the faint sting of humility. It wasn't that she was better. He couldn't admit that, not yet. It was that she was different, and difference in his world was something to be tested. So he began to press her harder, question by question, probing not out of malice but necessity. He needed to understand whether her brilliance was accident or design. What he didn't realize was that every question he asked drew him deeper into a dialogue he would not control. His curiosity, so long his greatest asset, was now leading him straight into a confrontation that would redefine the limits of intellect itself. Yet, even Breyer didn't see the trap his own curiosity was setting. Jasmine Crockett was never supposed to make it this far, not by the world's expectations. Anyway, she grew up in the hum of working class life, a house that was never quiet but never comfortable either. Her mother worked double shifts at a hospital. Her father juggled repair jobs that paid in cash and respect in equal measure. They didn't talk about the Supreme Court at the dinner table. They talked about bills, about neighbors, about the kind of dignity that comes from showing up even when no one thanks you for it. Jasmine learned early that power spoke a language few people in her world were taught to understand. She watched how words could silence rooms. Not fists, not money, but words. The first time she saw a courtroom, she wasn't inspired. She was angry. Angry that her friend's brother, a teenager who had done little more than be at the wrong place at the wrong time, had to face a judge who never once looked at him like a person. Jasmine remembered thinking, if this is justice, it needs a translator. That thought became a fire. In college, she was a student who sat in the front but didn't speak until it mattered. When she did, the room stopped. Professors learned her rhythm. Quiet observation, followed by surgical clarity. Her essays didn't just quote precedent, they questioned it. Her mentors called her old soul, new fire. Her classmates called her relentless. Both were right. Law school wasn't glamorous for her. She worked nights, waiting tables, filing paperwork, just to afford the books that would one day make her dangerous in the right ways. She studied in the corners of diner booths under flickering lights with exhaustion hanging from her shoulders like a second coat. While others dreamed of clerkships and corner offices, Jasmine dreamed of courtrooms with broken benches and clients who couldn't afford a name-brand lawyer. She chose criminal defense because that's where she saw the rot most clearly, the places where the system stopped pretending to be fair. Her first client was a single mother accused of theft because she couldn't pay for groceries. Jasmine stood in court that day, trembling but unflinching, and said, "If poverty is a crime, then Your Honor, half this city belongs behind bars." The judge didn't like it. The gallery did. And from that moment on, she knew. She wasn't built to blend in. Her reputation grew, not through politics, but through persistence. She became the lawyer who showed up when the cameras didn't. When protesters were arrested, she was there. When immigrant families faced sudden deportation orders, she was the one arguing late into the night, making her voice the last barrier between them and the machinery of bureaucracy. She wasn't loud by nature, but injustice demanded volume, and she learned how to wield hers. Still, her rise was not smooth. The establishment didn't welcome her, it tolerated her. She was told more than once to wait her turn, to temper her tone. She didn't. Every case she won felt like chiseling her name into stone with bare hands. Every loss felt like fuel. By the time she ran for Congress, people underestimated her, as they always had. Her opponents had money and endorsements. She had a worn-out car, a borrowed microphone, and a story that belonged to thousands. She spoke of representation, not as a slogan, but as repayment, a promise to the voices that had lifted her here. When she won, the victory wasn't hers alone. It was communal, a message carved from every overlooked neighborhood she'd ever defended. In Washington, she didn't soften. Her speeches were scalpel sharp, not designed for applause, but for clarity. She didn't grandstand, she educated. Her style confused some, threatened others, and inspired the rest. She called out hypocrisy without venom and debated with a surgeon's precision. Her critics labeled her too blunt. Her supporters called her fearless. But beneath the composure was a lifetime of scars, the kind you learn to hide behind grace. She had known what it meant to be dismissed before speaking, to be told that her intelligence was surprising, as if brilliance had a zip code or complexion. Those moments hardened her, not into cynicism, but into purpose. Every insult, every patronizing smile, every headline that reduced her to adjectives instead of argument, she turned them into quiet resolve. That resolve became her armor. Not loud, not flashy, just steady, the kind of strength that unnerves those who mistake calm for weakness. When the invitation came for her to argue before the Supreme Court on the voting rights case, she didn't see it as an opportunity for fame. She saw it as a reckoning. For generations, the fight over who gets to vote, who gets to belong, had been dressed up in legal language that sanitized its brutality. She knew that beneath every procedural safeguard lay a gatekeeping instinct as old as the Republic. She spent the night before the hearing in her office, surrounded by papers, headlines, and handwritten notes. Outside, DC buzzed with its usual self-importance, but inside, it was silent except for the hum of the fluorescent light above her. Her team urged her to rest, but rest felt like betrayal. Instead, she reviewed case histories like battle maps, tracing the lineage of exclusion written into the country's laws. In one corner of her desk sat a photograph of her parents, her mother in scrubs, her father in a faded work shirt. She stared at it for a long time. Everything she'd ever fought for came down to this, making sure people like them were never invisible in the country they built. When dawn broke, she walked up the marble steps of the Supreme Court, her heels echoing against stone. Tourists snapped photos nearby, unaware of the history that was about to unfold. The flag above her waved in the autumn wind, the same flag that had watched generations argue over freedom's fine print. Her colleagues noticed her calm. Cameras caught it too. That unshakable poise. It wasn't performance, it was preparation. Every courtroom where she'd been dismissed, every debate where she'd been underestimated, every night she'd stayed awake wondering if her fight mattered, it had all led her here. She wasn't walking into a courtroom that day. She was walking into the sum of her battles, into the heart of an institution that had written the rules she was now prepared to question. And as she stepped through those doors, there was no tremor in her hand, no hesitation in her stride. Because deep down, she knew all her battles had prepared her for one conversation that would echo through history. The air in the courtroom was dense, not loud, not chaotic, but dense, like sound itself had decided to hold its breath. Every rustle of paper, every cough from the gallery, every flicker of movement seemed amplified against the hush that hung between Justice Stephen Breyer and Representative Jasmine Crockett. The case before them was historic, a challenge to the Voting Rights Enforcement Amendment, legislation designed to restore protections gutted a decade earlier. To most, it was another policy debate. To Jasmine, it was personal, a question of who gets to count and who gets counted out. Breyer leaned forward, his expression thoughtful but sharp, the way a chess master looks before moving his queen. "Counselor," he began, his tone clipped and almost gentle, "you argue that this amendment doesn't overreach federal authority. Yet, every expansion of federal oversight risks eroding state sovereignty. Where, precisely, do you draw the line?" His phrasing was surgical, the kind that left most lawyers scrambling to find their footing. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She took a breath, steady, deliberate. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying evenly across the chamber, "the line isn't drawn by states or by Congress alone. It's drawn by the people. The same people whose voices this amendment protects. When that line blurs, it isn't government expanding. It's democracy defending itself." The words landed with quiet gravity. A few clerks glanced up from their notes. A journalist shifted in his seat. Breyer arched a brow. "A poetic answer," he said, "but the court doesn't rule on poetry. It rules on precedent." Jasmine smiled faintly, respectful but unmoved. "Then perhaps, Your Honor, it's time precedent remembered its purpose. Law without humanity becomes a mirror that reflects only the powerful." A murmur rippled through the spectators. Even Breyer's expression wavered, not annoyance, but intrigue. He adjusted his glasses and leaned back, the faintest trace of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. You speak as if the Constitution were an instrument of emotion rather than structure. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. Structure means nothing without the people it was built to serve. The Constitution was never meant to be a fortress. It was meant to be a bridge. There it was, that line. Simple, unadorned, but seismic. The gallery went still again. Breyer's eyes flicked downward, almost as if he were searching his notes for something that could blunt it. He found nothing. He shifted tactics. You're implying then, he said slowly, that judicial restraint, my restraint, has perpetuated inequity? The temperature in the room seemed to drop a degree. Jasmine chose her words carefully. I'm saying, Your Honor, that restraint becomes complicity when it protects comfort instead of justice. The sentence sliced clean through the silence. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then, the faint creak of a wooden bench as someone leaned forward, drawn into the gravity of what they were witnessing. Breyer didn't speak immediately. He glanced toward the other justices, some neutral, others faintly impressed, then back at her. You speak boldly for someone so new to this chamber, he said. Respectfully, Your Honor, she replied, the chamber's age doesn't determine the truth's validity. There it was again. Not defiance, but confidence born of conviction. No raised voice, no arrogance, just balance, measured strength. From the gallery, one of the senior reporters, a man who had covered 3 decades of hearings, whispered to his colleague. She's holding her ground like she's been here her whole life. Breyer folded his hands, his tone softening. You argue from principle. Admirable. But principles have limits when applied to power. The law is only as noble as the people interpreting it, she interjected, calmly but firmly. The interruption was daring. Breyer blinked, startled, then smiled faintly. So you are suggesting the court has failed? She paused, then met his gaze directly. Not failed, Your Honor. Forgotten. The word forgotten lingered like a bell. Every justice in the room seemed to feel it, that slight shiver that comes when truth touches something long buried. Breyer's posture shifted. The debate was no longer about technicalities. It had become a dialogue between generations, the established intellect and the insurgent conscience. He saw in her not defiance but reflection, a mirror of the passion he once had before years of precedent dulled its edge. The tension was electric but oddly intimate. 2 minds locked, one defending tradition, the other resurrecting purpose. And just as the air began to steady, Breyer tilted his head, curiosity sparking behind his calm exterior. Tell me, Representative Crockett, he said, voice lower now, almost conspiratorial, if justice is, as you imply, a living force, then why do so many claim it's dying? The question hit like a thunderclap, deceptively gentle, impossibly difficult. Cameras clicked once, then stopped. The room froze again. Every eye turned to her. Then came the question no one thought she could answer. The silence that followed Breyer's question was almost sacred, a long, suspended breath that seemed to hover between the marble walls. Cameras stilled. Pencils froze mid-air. Even the air conditioning hum felt like it had stopped out of respect for the moment. Jasmine Crockett stood motionless for a second, her palms resting lightly on the podium. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. Steady, deliberate. Every eye was on her, waiting for a stumble, a sign that she had reached her limit. But what they didn't know was that this moment was her element. Inside, she inhaled slowly, centering herself. They expect hesitation, she thought, so I'll give them precision instead. When she spoke, her tone was calm, but the words cut like clean glass. Your Honor, she began, justice doesn't die. It's only buried under excuses, under precedent, under fear of change. But every generation comes to dig it up again. A few heads in the gallery tilted. The metaphor landed like poetry wrapped in reason. She continued before anyone could break the rhythm. Let's go back to Brown versus Board of Education, she said, her voice gaining quiet strength. The court didn't wait for public opinion to catch up before declaring segregation unconstitutional. It recognized that equality delayed is equality denied. And in Shelby County versus Holder, when this court gutted Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, it didn't end discrimination. It just made it harder to prove. Breyer shifted in his chair. His fingers tapped once against his notes. The faintest sound, but in this silence, it thundered. Jasmine saw it. the flicker of discomfort that flashes when truth collides with habit. She pressed on. So when people say justice is dying, they're really saying we stopped listening to those who need it most. The law doesn't decay on its own. We let it. Her voice softened, not in retreat, but in reflection. Justice isn't a relic, Your Honor. It's a responsibility. Every time this court hesitates to protect a right, someone outside this chamber loses one. The line landed like a slow exhale. Somewhere behind her, a clerk dropped a pen. The small metallic clink echoed absurdly loud, drawing a few startled glances. Breyer adjusted his glasses, a gesture that had become his tell, the sign of deep thought, or perhaps disquiet. You cite powerful examples, Representative Crockett, he said quietly, but the law must also guard against overreach. We cannot legislate every injustice. Jasmine nodded, meeting him halfway. You're right, Your Honor. We can't legislate every injustice, but we can make sure the law doesn't enable it. There it was, the pivot, respectful yet unflinching. She took one step closer to the podium. The Constitution doesn't promise perfection. It promises progress. Every case before this court is a test, not of the law's strength, but of our courage to interpret it humanely. Her gaze swept the bench, moving from justice to justice, pausing briefly on Breyer again. You once wrote, she continued, that the court's legitimacy depends not just on logic, but on trust. You were right, but trust isn't earned by restraint, it's earned by fairness. For a heartbeat, Breyer looked as though he might respond, but he didn't. His eyes flickered downward. Jasmine could almost see the memories behind them. Decades of rulings, of debates, of moments when idealism bowed to caution. She pressed forward, her voice growing softer but somehow larger, filling the chamber. When a voter in rural Alabama or South Dallas stands in line for 6 hours just to cast a ballot, that's not an inconvenience. That's a message. It says their voice weighs less, and if this court won't speak for them, who will? Her words landed not like a hammer, but like an awakening. The audience leaned in, journalists, clerks, even the opposing counsel. The rhythm of her cadence, in steady, measured, commanding, pulled everyone into the same heartbeat. Breyer leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, slowly. So, you would have this court act as moral arbiter, not just interpreter? Jasmine met his gaze again, unwavering. No, Your Honor. I'd have this court remember that morality was always the foundation of interpretation. The framers didn't write the Constitution to preserve power. They wrote it to limit it. That did it. Breyer's hand stilled midair, glasses poised halfway to his face. For the first time in years, the unflappable justice looked moved. She continued, her tone lower now, intimate, almost confessional. You once told a graduating class that the law is like a conversation between generations. I believe that. I believe today that conversation needs a new voice. Not louder, just clearer. Breyer's fingers lowered. His glasses touched the desk with a quiet tap. Around the courtroom, the silence had changed. It was no longer expectant. It was reverent. Then, with the faintest hint of awe, he said it. The line that would freeze the room. Representative Crockett, he murmured, his voice breaking its usual formality. In 27 years on this bench, I've rarely encountered such clarity or such courage. A ripple of shock moved through the spectators. A few clerks exchanged stunned glances. One of the journalists mouthed, "Did he just say that?" Jasmine held his gaze, her expression calm but her pulse quickening. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the moment for what it was, a recognition, not of her, but of what she represented. Breyer leaned back, exhaling slowly. The court will take a brief recess, he said, but his voice carried something new, a trace of humility. As the gavel struck, the chamber seemed to wake from a collective trance. People began to move again, but cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the air that still vibrated with what had just happened. Jasmine gathered her papers, her movements composed, yet inside a storm swirled, not of triumph, but of disbelief. He said it out loud. After decades of silence and subtle dismissals, one of the highest voices in American law had spoken respect into existence, not as concession, but as truth. As she turned to leave, a young law clerk caught her eye. A black woman, maybe in her 20s, standing at the edge of the room. The clerk didn't speak. She just nodded, eyes bright, as if to say, "We saw you." Jasmine nodded back, the faintest ghost of a smile touching her lips. Outside, as the doors opened, the cool air of the hallway hit her face. Cameras waited. Phones were already out. Somewhere beyond those walls, the headlines were forming. But Jasmine knew the real story hadn't started yet, because outside those walls, where noise replaced silence, where perception rewrote truth, the real explosion was only beginning. It hit the internet before Jasmine Crockett even reached the courthouse steps. A 10-second clip. Justice Breyer leaning forward, voice low, saying, "I've rarely encountered such clarity or such courage." The camera had caught her expression. Calm, unreadable, the faintest nod of acknowledgement. And that was all it took. By the time she exited into the sunlight, the clip had already detonated online. Within an hour, it was everywhere. Hashtags mushroomed across platforms like wildfire, hashtag Crockett versus Breyer, hashtag Courtroom Clarity, hashtag Justice Speaks, hashtag Respect Earned, hashtag Voting Rights 2025. On TikTok, creators remixed her words. The Constitution isn't a fortress, it's a bridge, over cinematic music, slow zoom edits, and pulsing bass drops. One video hit 3 million views before noon. On Twitter, the divide was instantaneous. Progressives called it the moment dignity reclaimed the mic. Conservatives accused her of grandstanding. Legal analysts split into factions, each dissecting her tone, her phrasing, the nerve of challenging a sitting justice. CNN ran the clip on repeat under the headline, "A Rare Admission in America's Highest Court." Meanwhile, Fox countered with, "Crockett overstepped. Did Breyer cave to pressure?" The country wasn't just watching a courtroom exchange anymore, it was watching a referendum on who gets to speak truth in power's house. Everywhere, reactions cascaded. A Harvard law professor tweeted, "This moment will be studied for years." Breyer didn't lose control, he found integrity. A right-wing pundit fired back, "If courtroom theatrics are courage, the rule of law is doomed." A grassroots activist from Atlanta simply wrote, "She spoke for every ballot they tried to bury." Within 12 hours, late-night hosts were weaving the clip into their monologues. Memes exploded, Breyer's thoughtful stare, Jasmine's poised gaze, captions like, "When your student becomes a teacher," and "That moment the system blinked." On Instagram, stylized edits turned the hearing into art. Black and white stills of the court overlaid with Jasmine's quote, "Law without humanity becomes a mirror that reflects only the powerful one." Influencer wrote beneath it, "Frame this. Teach this. Live this." Cable debates erupted like bonfires. Panels of commentators, former clerks, and political strategists leaned into the spectacle. Some called it the rebirth of moral law. Others sneered that it was political theater dressed in rhetoric. But even cynics couldn't deny the impact. Breyer's words had cracked open something raw. In Dallas, church congregations replayed the clip during Sunday service. In law schools, professors paused their lectures to discuss it. In barbershops and diners, people argued not about party lines, but about what respect looks like when power shifts hands. And through it all, Jasmine stayed silent. Her team advised statements, press conferences, morning shows, but she refused. "Not yet," she said. "Let the moment breathe." Behind that quiet was strategy and instinct. She knew that every time she spoke, someone would try to shrink it, reframe it, drain it of meaning, but silence, she realized, had power too. In the absence of her voice, the country kept replaying hers from that day, not filtered, not paraphrased, but raw and unedited. By the third day, the moment had become myth. Op-eds declared it a generational shift in legal tone. Students wore t-shirts reading "Clarity and Courage" in stylized serif fonts. A mural appeared overnight on a Dallas underpass. Her silhouette backlit by marble columns with Breyer's quote in white paint above, "Such clarity, such courage." But not all the noise was praise. Anonymous accounts flooded forums calling her disrespectful, ungrateful, arrogant. A senator on live television called the exchange a dangerous precedent, politicians lecturing the judiciary. And yet, every attempt to discredit her only amplified the clip again. Cable anchors began calling it the Breyer moment. Some framed it as the old guard's humility, others as the young reformer's triumph. But to millions watching, it wasn't about sides anymore, it was about possibility. Because for the first time in years, America had seen two things coexist that were rarely allowed in the same room: brilliance and belonging. Across timelines, a quote began circulating audience, not from Breyer, not from Crockett, but from a random comment on YouTube. Greater than when the system finally listens to the people it was built for, that's not politics. That's progress. It was pinned, shared, reposted thousands of times. By week's end, the clip had crossed 100 million views. Newsrooms called it the moment that reset the tone of civic debate. Still, in the noise, something deeper stirred. Amid hashtags and headlines, a quieter question began to surface. Whispered in think pieces, tweeted between allies, murmured in classrooms. Was it really respect or recognition long overdue? And as the weekend closed, the frenzy began to fade, replaced not by silence but reflection. The moment had passed, but the echo remained. Breyer's words, her gaze, the weight of history pressed into a single exchange. It had forced a nation to ask itself what it meant to honor intellect when it came from a voice the system wasn't built to hear. Screens dimmed, comment threads slowed, the country exhaled, and when the noise finally faded, one question remained. What does respect really mean in power? She didn't celebrate. No victory lap, no press tour, no triumphant interviews. The next morning, Jasmine Crockett woke before dawn, just as she always did. She brewed her coffee in the quiet hum of her kitchen, opened her worn notebook, and began writing again. Not speeches, not statements, but thoughts, reflections. Because for her, that moment in the courtroom wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about proving that truth, when spoken with grace, still has weight in a world addicted to noise. The storm outside had been deafening. The hashtags, the pundits, the partisan spin. But here, in the stillness of her morning, the only sound was the slow turn of pages. And that, she realized, was where the real work began. She replayed Breyer's words in her mind. Such clarity. Such courage, not as a trophy, but as a mirror. What had she really earned? What had he really given? Respect, she thought, was never something you demanded. It was something you carried. You built it from preparation, you protected it with principle, and you proved it through purpose. In law school, she remembered being the youngest in the room, often the only black woman, the one who always had to be twice as right to be heard once. Respect hadn't come from titles or honors. It came from showing up again and again when it would have been easier to stay silent. That same resilience had carried her through courtrooms, campaigns, and committees, through every door that wasn't built for her to walk through. And standing before one of the nation's most revered jurists, she hadn't seen an opponent. She'd seen an opportunity, to show that intellect could exist without arrogance, and that conviction could coexist with calm. Because that was the quiet power she had always believed in. The ability to meet condescension with clarity, to disarm superiority not with anger, but with understanding. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the moment struck such a nerve. Because deep down, everyone watching recognized something universal. That respect, real respect, isn't about who speaks louder, but who listens deeper. Breyer had built a lifetime on brilliance. She had built one on persistence. Their exchange wasn't a duel of egos. It was a conversation across generations about what wisdom should look like when it grows. For all his years on the bench, Breyer had taught the law. But that day, he learned something about humanity. And for all her battles in the trenches, Jasmine reminded the nation that humility doesn't bow. It stands taller by choice. As she closed her notebook and looked out the window, the sun was just breaking the horizon. A soft gold line over the city skyline. The world outside was still arguing about who won. But in her heart, she knew that wasn't the point. The point was that for one brief, electric moment, the system had paused and listened. Not because she demanded respect, but because she embodied it. She thought of the young women watching. Students, interns, public defenders, activists. The ones who had been told to wait their turn, to temper their tone, to smile through dismissal. Maybe now, they'd see that brilliance and kindness didn't cancel each other out. Maybe they'd see that grace could be powerful too. She smiled softly. If that's all this moment does, she whispered, it's enough. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't how loud the world cheered, but how deeply it remembered. Respect wasn't about winning, it was about reminding the world that dignity, the calm kind, the earned kind, could still silence arrogance better than any argument ever could. And somewhere between the noise and the stillness, America seemed to feel it too. For a single, fleeting instant, the shouting stopped. The scrolling slowed. The nation listened, not to outrage, not to ego, but to something far rarer, a tone, a truth, a sound that felt like balance returning to the room. In that silence, America remembered what respect sounds like. But will that silence turn into lasting change? And maybe that's where this story truly begins. Not in a courtroom, not in headlines, but in the quiet decision each of us makes about the kind of world we want to defend. Because if Jasmine Crockett taught us anything, it's that brilliance doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs the courage to stay calm when the room demands chaos. It needs the patience to turn confrontation into clarity and the faith that truth, when spoken with purpose, will always find its audience. Justice Breyer's words may have frozen the court, but it was her composure that thawed something deeper. The belief that respect still has a place in power. So here's the question that lingers long after the cameras fade. When the next moment of arrogance arrives, when the next voice tries to drown out reason, who will stay steady? Who will stand for grace over noise, intellect over intimidation? Because that's what this channel stands for. Stories of courage wrapped in composure, of conviction that doesn't need to shout. If you believe calm brilliance still deserves the last word, subscribe, because voices like hers remind us that respect is power. Share this story if you've ever been underestimated. Comment if you've ever had to earn your respect the hard way. And remember, every time you choose dignity in a world built on division, you're continuing this story. The headlines will fade, the noise will return, but somewhere, someone will remember the silence and everything it stood for, because respect isn't gone, it's waiting, and it begins again, right here, with you.